Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Aims of Education address for 2018. All colleges and universities have customs, venerable customs and traditions, and the University of Chicago has more than most. And appropriate to a university that was founded in 1890 as an engine of educational innovation, one of our most esteemed annual traditions involves thinking about and even debating the aims of liberal education. Each fall, in the week before classes resume and the new academic year is upon us with full force, we invite a senior faculty member to address the entering first-year class and transfer students assembled in Rockefeller Chapel with her or his thoughts about liberal education and its meaning and value to our lives. The general title accorded to these talks was adapted from Alfred North Whitehead's famous lecture on the aims of education, given in 1916 as the presidential address to the Mathematical Association of England. The annual Aims lectures began as a student initiative in the early 1960s in the college, and over the decades they've become a sturdy and even venerable part of our common and shared history. They are thus a part of that system of shared values and our common citizenship that I discussed in the course of greeting you and your parents in this chapel several days ago. The first Aims of Education address was in fact a series of lectures on liberal education held during the 1961-62 academic year. An important feature of that year was the participation of Robert Maynard Hutchins, who returned to our campus for the occasion, having been retired from the presidency of the University of Chicago for nearly a decade. Hutchins, who, as you may know, was one of our most distinguished presidents, spoke here in the chapel in the spring of 1962 before an audience as large as this one, and he spoke, as he always had done, as president in defense of liberal learning. During his presidency, Robert Maynard Hutchins gave decisive shape to the traditions and ideals of liberal learning and liberal education that still animate our college. It is fitting that we honor his memory on this occasion and in this chapel. The Aims address are now published by the college in Hutchins' honor, thanks to generous gifts from alumni and alums who celebrate his role in shaping our ideals. I should also mention that it is a central feature of this particular ritual that the Aims speaker is given absolutely no instructions or substantive guidance from the dean of the college or anyone else other than informing her or him of the time or the place at which the lecture is to be held so they can show up. To be invited to deliver the annual Aims address is a considerable honor, but also a challenge. And it is no accident that most, if not all, of the Aims speakers in the past have been colleagues, not only esteemed as foremost scholars, but also as brilliant teachers. Our speaker this evening is Professor Gabriel Richardson Lear, Professor of Philosophy, the Committee on Social Thought in the college. Gabriel is a distinguished and original scholar of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and ethics, who taught at Yale University before joining the University of Chicago faculty in 2003. Her first book, Happy Lives and the Highest Good, took up the challenge of interpreting Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and explored in provocative ways the relationship between morally virtuous action and contemplation in the pursuit of the happy life. She is currently writing about Plato's aesthetics and the status of beauty as an ethical concept in the work of other philosophers. Gabriel is not only a scholar of broad erudition and analytic power, but she's also a superb teacher who has inspired and motivated thousands of students. She's recently taught courses like Ancient Greek Aesthetics, Ancient Philosophy, and Aristotle's Politics. Students routinely give her courses superlative ratings with accolades like, "A truly amazing instructor in person. She knows so much and every lecture was mind-blowing." Or, "An incredible, superb lecturer. Professor Lear has complete mastery over the text." Or, "She is almost absurdly knowledgeable about ancient philosophy." Other students credit her with sparking an enduring interest in philosophy. As one student recently attested, "I feel so lucky to have had a strong, brilliant woman guide me through my first introduction to philosophy. Her lectures were consistently insightful, engaging, and explanatory. I admire and look up to Professor Lear in a variety of ways." Now, great teaching, such as these commendations reveal, lies at the heart of the central purpose of our university. The efforts of our faculty over the past century to create and to define this great university's teaching traditions were often complex because they not only involved worrying about structural formalities, but because they were infused with a strong sense of pride and a profound sense that our work as educators would have a dramatic impact on the resilience of the fundamental values that must define the university. Many years ago, a past Aims of Education lecturer and a distinguished humanist, Professor Carl J. Weintraub, argued that teaching was not simply a way of valorizing the university's institutional mission, but also a kind of confession of the power of the university in constituting the kind of world we want to bequeath to the young people who come after us. Jacques wrote, "A teacher finds his satisfaction simply in having raised consciousness by one little notch. It may make all the difference between mediocrity and excellence in life. The quality of a culture depends ultimately on this sustained cultivation of sensitivities, of refined taste, and of sound judgment. There is no cheap, easy way to culture. Much of the true cultural labor is not readily visible, but in this invisible labor," he wrote, "lies the great contribution a university makes to all that is visible to the larger world." The vocation of teaching has come to define the highest and the best nature of this institution, and it is thus a great pleasure and a high honor for me to introduce a great teacher, my distinguished colleague and friend, Gabriel Richardson Lear, who will deliver the 2018 address on the aims of education.
Wow, there are a lot of you here. Welcome to the University of Chicago. It's so wonderful to see you here, to hear your voices when I walked in, to see this press of humanity bringing this space to life. More than 1,700 people can fit into this space. But right now, as I look at you, I don't see simply you. I also remember previous entering classes gathered for aims of education addresses in previous years. Students who are now sophomores, juniors, seniors, or who have graduated. I am also aware of the thousands of professors and staff people who have been preparing for your arrival in the buildings surrounding this ceremonial space. On the outside, Rockefeller Chapel is festooned with carvings of people, actual students from the 1920s, religious figures, famous poets and musicians and philosophers. Universities are not places. They are the massive collective undertaking and activity of people now and in the past. In this enormous building, dedicated to ceremonies marking major milestones in the life of our community, I feel their presence too. A choir of faculty, students, alumni, and staff, past and present. I am profoundly honored to be able to say on their behalf as well, welcome to the life of this great university. Earlier this summer, I stopped by Rockefeller Chapel and had a more solitary experience. It was one of those hot, quiet days typical of the campus in summer. It was cool in here, and apart from the attendant, it was empty. Something about the coolness after being outside and the smallness of my echoing steps and the distance of the windows where the light was filtering in, something about being in this place made me feel not so much that I had entered a new world, as aware in a new way of how extraordinary our world is. The architecture of this place makes you look up, and being in this quiet, cool space, I could sense the bodiliness of the air that surrounds us, and I was aware how high up our atmosphere extends, how wide is the expanse of the air. The Gothic style of architecture, the style of this chapel, is intended to inspire awe. And insofar as the style of Rockefeller Chapel is intended to give us a transformative vision of our everyday world, it is an ideal place for you to begin your career as students at the University of Chicago. People often refer disparagingly to universities as the ivory tower, as if it were a place that's beautiful, but cut off from and irrelevant to some other world that is, as they say, the real world. But this is an image that seriously misunderstands what's supposed to be happening here. The academic life, the life of both students and faculty, is different in many ways from the life in the business world or in the political world. It moves at a different pace. But the point of this difference is to put us in a position to experience the world, the real world, truthfully, and ultimately to live in the world in a more truthful way. So I've been asked to speak tonight about the aims of education, about where you are heading and what we hope you will achieve over the next 4 years. But I want to begin with wonder. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato is famous for saying that philosophia, the love of wisdom, begins in wondering. I think he's right about that. Wondering in the sense that Plato is talking about is not simply a mood or a subjective experience or a feeling in your head. It is a way, a truthful way of being oriented to the world. The love of wisdom begins in wonder because the person who wonders is, so to speak, turned in the right direction to find the kind of knowledge that actually matters for life. We may say then that wonder is the virtue, the excellence of the student. I've been saying that Rockefeller Chapel seems to me like a good place to hold an orientation event because it's built in a style that encourages wonder, a transformative experience of the vast reality of the natural world, wonder at the extraordinary collective human accomplishment of universities, and of this university in particular. Rockefeller Chapel encourages wondering, and wondering is exactly what you, as students, should be doing. Before I go on, though, I should acknowledge that although Rockefeller Chapel does strike me as wonderful right now, you may not feel that way. And let's face it, this place is strange. This is a building that was built in the 1920s. At the very moment when architects downtown were making world historical innovations in the design of skyscrapers, the leaders of the University of Chicago decided to build Rockefeller Chapel in the style of a church from the Middle Ages. Did they register the discrepancy? Stranger still, although Rockefeller Chapel is built to resemble a medieval church, it has virtually no Christian iconography. Now, the austerity of the interior is due in part, I suppose, to the fact that the founders of the University of Chicago were Baptists, who traditionally, like all Protestants, viewed the ornate interiors of Catholic churches with suspicion, a fact which, if anything, makes their choice to build a church in the style of a medieval Catholic church all the more obscure. But the strangeness of the interior decoration of this building goes beyond the fraught relation of Protestantism to Catholicism. No matter how they are designed, Protestant and Catholic churches are churches. But according to the website, Rockefeller Chapel is, quote, not a church in any traditional sense. Instead, it is, quote, a major center for the performing arts, as well as serving as the ceremonial and spiritual center of the University of Chicago. So, despite initial appearances, Rockefeller Chapel is not, in fact, a church, at least not in a normal sense. I think you can actually see this when you look at the decoration in detail. But then, what is this place? And what are we to make of the fact that it looks like a church? I could go on. My point is, it's not hard to get yourself into a position where instead of experiencing wonder in the sense of awe, you wonder in a more skeptical vein. Who were these people who thought that building a building like this was a good idea? Who are the people now who say that this is not a church, while at the same time insisting that this church-looking building is the university's spiritual center? The suspicion arises that there's something fake about the design of the place. The suspicion arises that it's a cliché, a theatrical and ultimately thoughtless evocation of a great tradition of British universities. Oxford and Cambridge had chapels in the Gothic style, so let's build one too. Now, I find that to be a pretty unsettling thought. The University of Chicago is renowned for its innovations in higher education and for the seriousness of its thinking about the liberal arts. However, pondering the strangeness of this building, you might begin to wonder, is this imitation medieval church an anomaly? Or is it a symptom of something equally theatrical and cliched about the university's practice of liberal education? So here then are two different kinds of wondering that are opposed to each other. My initial ecstatic amazement at the awesomeness of this space, and my later skeptical and suspicious questioning. It's the difference between wow and wait a second, this doesn't add up. It isn't so great after all. And notice that these are opposed reactions to the very same phenomenon, the architecture of Rockefeller Chapel. So I ask you, if the love of wisdom begins in wondering, if wondering is what you, as a student, are supposed to be doing, which sort of wondering is it? Awe or skepticism? Notice that both kinds of wondering feel like ways of genuinely understanding something, and so both feel like ways of being oriented truthfully. When you sit down next week with your first assignments in the humanities core, when you attend your first seminars, which attitude should you try to take? Now, it seems to me that neither awe nor skeptical suspicion is a promising starting point for a journey to greater wisdom. Now, it's pretty easy to see what the danger of ecstatic wondering is. The experience is so exhilarating that it tends to blow away the possibility of further analytic thought. We don't want to disturb the moment. I don't mean to suggest that there is necessarily something wrong or suspect about awestruck wondering. The world does contain extraordinarily good and beautiful things, and if you never experience awe, you will fail to register that truth. However, when this sort of wondering gets mixed up with our habits of inquiry, it can make one complacent and defensive. You would rather enjoy the experience of understanding instead of risking being plunged back into uncertainty. So even if awe is sometimes appropriate, and believe me, sometimes I am overwhelmed with admiration for the extraordinary accomplishments of Plato and Aristotle, the philosophers that I study. So I do think that awe towards them is appropriate. But indulging in this emotion is more of a hindrance than a help to understanding what they thought or whether they were right. So you might think that skeptical wondering is the more promising option. Being alert for inconsistency and incoherence, not taking for granted that it all adds up. This kind of skeptical attitude may seem like an antidote to the complacency of awe. And furthermore, it may seem like the very thing you're supposed to be doing as students at the University of Chicago. We are a university famous for its love of debate, its refusal to treat any authority as beyond question or criticism. Now, I love this argumentative University of Chicago ethos. And actually, right before I gave this address, Professor Rosner, who gave the Aims of Education address last year, was already raising objections to my address before I had even given it. So I love that. This is the debate that just makes me feel so alive. And just as awestruck wondering is sometimes appropriate, so too, sometimes skeptical questioning is an important and good thing to do. Some apparently self-evident ideas are in fact self-serving illusions that ought to be dismantled. But the problem is this: habits of questioning and refutation can become their own form of complacency and mindlessness. It's just too easy to poke holes in the rational pretensions of serious people, especially when they are trying to articulate ideas about how to live a worthwhile human life. With enough practice, you can fashion a plausible-sounding critique of pretty much anything. I started to do this with the design of Rockefeller Chapel, and I am sure I could have gone on, finding places where the thoughts of Harper and Hutchins and other early leaders of this university are not really consistent, or places where their practice of education conflicted with their ideals, thereby casting doubt on the coherence of their intellectual enterprise. But if your basic stance towards the ideas of others is a stance of skeptical wondering, you're liable to develop an unexamined sense of superiority. It's possible to wonder in the sense of doubting others without ever really challenging yourself to consider whether the views you challenge are getting something right. Worse, heuristic, the habitual activity of trying to tear down another person's argument, is merely destructive. This sort of wondering is good at shaking our confidence in the worthiness of any ideal or in the truthfulness of any set of ideas, but it's not good at showing us where to place our trust. And this, in turn, may lead us to believe that there's no such thing as rationally grounded trust. It is a short step from here to the belief that rational argument is really just a cudgel, an exercise of force. So here's the problem I'd like you to think about this evening. You're here to learn, and the goal of all learning is knowledge or wisdom of some sort. But wisdom is a distant goal. How will you take the first step on your journey? Plato said that wondering is the beginning of the path to wisdom. But I've just been arguing that there are at least two kinds of wondering, awe and skeptical questioning, and that neither of them is a fruitful beginning of an education. But what other sort of wondering is there? So, as I always do, I say, let's return to Plato to see what he might have been thinking. The famous saying that philosophia begins in wondering occurs in a dialogue he wrote called the Theaetetus. It depicts a conversation between Plato's teacher Socrates and a young man named Theaetetus. Theaetetus was a real person who grew up to be a well-regarded mathematician and also a brave, honorable soldier. But at the time of the dialogue, he is a young man, full of promise for the future. He and Socrates are trying to figure out what knowledge is. Theaetetus makes a suggestion, Socrates refutes it. Theaetetus tries again, and Socrates refutes that suggestion too, and so on. At a certain point, Socrates reflects on what's happening, how sometimes we can say something we sincerely believe to be true, and then, a little while later, after reflecting further, we find ourselves saying something that contradicts what seems true to us before. This is not a matter of changing your mind. Rather, this is a case of looking at an issue from one point of view and the truth appearing to be one way, and then looking at it from another angle and the truth appearing to be a way that contradicts the first. The situation feels ridiculous, Socrates says. We know we're getting something wrong, and yet we were sincere in each of the claims we made, and the mere fact of contradiction doesn't show you which claim is wrong. Being caught in contradiction is what Socrates and Plato called aporia, knowing that something you think must be wrong, but not knowing which thing it is, since each claim you make seems to be true on its own. Literally, aporia means being without, poros, a way out. In other words, it's a condition of being stuck. Now, this might make a person despair, and if you've read other Platonic dialogues, you know that despair or anger or sheer fatigue is usually the way people react to Socrates' refutations. But Theaetetus reacts with excited, joyful wonder. Socrates, he says, I know exactly the sort of ridiculous situation you're talking about. These arguments that lead to contradiction make me wonder like crazy. And here is where the famous saying comes. I can see what kind of person you are, Socrates says. For this is an experience that is characteristic of a lover of wisdom. This wondering is where the love of wisdom begins, and nowhere else. And the myth-maker who made Iris the child of Thaumas was a good genealogist. Now notice a few things. First, Theaetetus' wondering is the result of being challenged and refuted by Socrates. So the activity of looking for flaws in another person's argument, the sort of wondering that I called skeptical wondering before, does have a place in the pursuit of wisdom. However, according to Plato, the person who wonders is not the person who raises doubts. It is the person being questioned. The person who wonders is the person who is brought to contradict himself, who realizes that the things he thinks don't add up. So, if you're trying to take the first steps towards wisdom, don't begin by looking for flaws in another person's argument. Try instead to get someone to challenge you. Of course, someone will have to do the questioning and the raising of doubts, and sometimes you may be called upon to play that role. So it's worth remembering that a person who poses challenging questions can also share in the experience of refutation, to the extent that she shares the point of view that she's challenging. In that case, your refutation of another person will also be a refutation of yourself. So if you want the activity of challenging another person's ideas to be fruitful for yourself, you should try a sympathetic outlook. Understanding, really understanding, how the world could look as it does to your conversational partner. Only then should you explain why this outlook is incompatible with some other claim that you and she are confident must be true. That way, you will be able to share in the refutation and experience wonder too. So the first lesson we can learn from Plato is this: wonder is the result of being challenged. It is not the activity of challenging itself. The second thing I'd like you to notice is Socrates' approving attitude towards the myth that makes Iris the child of Thaumas. Now here you need to know that the word for wonder in ancient Greek is thauma. And in Greek mythology, Iris is the rainbow, a messenger between gods and mortals. So what the myth says, according to Socrates, is that wonder is the parent of Iris, the messenger of the gods, to humans. But if wonder is pregnant with a messenger, then it contains some message, some intimation of the truth. And that would be marvelous, wonderful, like the rainbow. So even though wondering arises in the context of aporia, being stuck, it is nevertheless a joyful and a hopeful reaction. When we put these observations together, I think this is what Plato is saying. The sort of wondering that leads to wisdom involves a vivid awareness that your ideas about the world don't hang together in a coherent whole, but also, crucially, a glimmer of where wisdom lies. What Plato realized is that there's a way of asking questions, a way of challenging our previous assumptions, that brings the intelligibility of a phenomenon newly into view. Like wondering in the sense of awe, this sort of wondering is transformative, seeing the world in a new way. Now, maybe you've experienced what I'm talking about. It's like when you're trying to figure something out and making no headway, and then suddenly you realize, wait a second, I've been approaching this problem in the completely wrong way. What I should be asking is this. That's wonder. Wonder is an experience of the structure of reality that arises from the realization that your previous theories do not add up or do not fit the phenomena. You have a new sense of the space of possibilities, and so you are able to ask a new question. This sort of wondering, the ability to ask a fruitful question because you now see something about the structure of the right answer that you hadn't grasped before, this sort of wondering is an accomplishment. It is the ability to step back from specific beliefs about narrow parts of the world and see something about how the whole fits together. It is this reorientation to the whole that allows for intellectual creativity. Plato said that philosophia, the loving pursuit of wisdom, begins in wondering. But I hope it's now clear that this is not actually the first thing you're going to do in the course of your education. A big part of your education will be learning enough to put yourself in a position to wonder. In some cases, you will need to learn enough about a subject to realize that it really is important, that the truth of it matters to you. So speaking for my own case, I am so incredibly grateful to the college that I went to that it forced me to take an introductory geology class. It was called Rocks for Jocks. I wasn't a jock, but I thought that was sort of my speed. I had no idea how interesting rocks could be. But I did not have this epiphany until almost the end of the course. And that actually led me to take more geology courses just for the fun of it. In other cases, so that's, one thing is you just need to learn enough to even realize that there's something amazing here that you need to understand. But in other cases, you will already think that something is important, but you'll need to learn enough to realize that you yourself do not yet understand it, may not have even really begun to think about it. Now, you should expect that you suffer this kind of ignorance, thinking that you know what you do not know. It's an aspect of the human condition, I'm sorry to say. We are cultural creatures, animals who not only live together, but together imbue our lives and actions with meaning. Every single intentional action you perform is something you do because you think you know what you're doing. I mean, I'm not talking about deep knowledge. It's just you think you know you're sitting here because you're supposed to be listening to this address. I mean, human action is shot through with it's the action that we do because we think we know what we're doing. But the meaningfulness of our actions is not an atom on its own. It takes its significance from the collective cultural ways we have developed of living. Your parents, mentors, and peers taught you how to interpret your actions as you were growing up. And there is enormous pressure, internal pressure, to keep interpreting your life in the ways of your culture. Now, I'm not saying that the ideas you've been taught are necessarily wrong. It's probably a mix, but that's not my point. My point is that even to the extent that your ideas about important things are true, it can be very hard to really think about them, to feel the friction that comes from your mind being shaped by reality, rather than by how you would like reality to be. One of the main reasons it's so important to study influential works of the past and of other cultures is precisely because it will help you in this project. However misguided Homer or Plato or Euripides or Aristotle may have been, these were serious people trying to make sense of the world and to articulate it truthfully. I find that really entering sympathetically into their way of thinking can have the salutary effect of making me aware of the ungroundedness of my own positions, a sort of historically induced aporia. And sometimes there is the wonderful realization that actually they are in fact onto something, that they are seeing the very world I'm looking at, but from the other side, so to speak. In any case, wisdom-loving wonder does not come easily. It can take a lot of work, a lot of study of the natural world, a lot of study of the past and of other cultures to put yourself in a position to experience fruitful, truth-oriented wonder. In fact, I think it's fair to say that wondering and developing habits of wondering is not just the beginning of wisdom, it is the aim of a liberal arts education. Now, I don't mean that you should always be aiming to be at the very beginning of your journey. While you are here at the University of Chicago, you're going to study theories and stories and images that will, for the rest of your lives, orient you to the world and to yourselves. But these theories and ideas have the power to orient you truthfully only if, in thinking through them, you are alive to the newness of the new phenomena you will encounter later in life. You must be alive to the interconnectedness of your orienting ideas. You must be ready to step back and ask whether the new phenomena you encounter fit with the world as you had previously understood it, or whether instead it's the proof that your way of thinking about the world doesn't quite add up. And on those occasions when you find that your most cherished theories do not get things right, you must have sufficient experience of wondering to embrace this realization with hope, not feeling stuck in aporia and so tempted to retreat into your illusions, but confident that you are able to ask fruitful questions and reorient yourselves in a more truthful direction. Now, I said that wondering is the aim of a liberal arts education, the sort of education suitable for free people like you. The freedom at issue here is, to borrow Aristotle's memorable phrase, the freedom of people with the power of choice. You have the power of choice, the authority and ability to shape your own lives and the lives of your communities. Free people need orienting ideas to help them put different aspects of their lives together into a world. But they also need the ability to face up to it when circumstances show that their ideas don't all fit together. And they need to react to this disorienting and sometimes painful experience with productive wondering rather than with defensiveness. The dangers of confusing real wondering with either awe-filled amazement or skeptical doubting are not merely hypothetical, and they are not limited to the academic life. No doubt, as students, you've already encountered people who love to criticize the ideas of others because they thrill to the sense of victory, and whose defense of the truth is really just an excuse to revel in the feeling of power. And you may also have encountered students who are so enamored of an idea or way of looking at the world that they will not really think about whether it's true. Perhaps you yourselves have been drawn in these directions. But what is far more troubling to me is that these unwisdom-loving ways of wondering are pervasive in the intellectual culture of our country. An intellectual culture in which there often seem to be only two possibilities: refuting the ideas of others or preaching to the choir. Both of these intellectual postures is sclerotic, incapable of having that aha moment that is so necessary for intellectual creativity and for truthfulness. Now, I've got to tell you, the past 18 years, the years of your life, have been punctuated by events that have seriously shaken people's confidence that they understand the world they're living in. 9/11, the 2008 financial and housing crisis, Brexit, American government agents separating immigrant children from their parents at the border. I won't go on. You all have lived through a lot, and I would bet you're getting tired of hearing about what dark and unsettled times we live in. So I'm here to tell you that I think you're fortunate in at least one respect. Whereas the world of my college days was, in retrospect, shockingly complacent, you live in times in which the inadequacy of major worldviews is obvious, even if we disagree about where the fault lies. So although these are scary times, they are also times in which the conditions are right for wondering, and so for imagining new, better possibilities for living together. I hope you'll take advantage of that. But it takes a lot of work to put yourself into a position to wonder, and it also takes a lot of courage. I've been thinking about what our life together at this university must be like in order to facilitate wisdom-loving wonder. Since wonder is the result of being challenged, it's important that we have a culture of speaking our minds and of tolerating, even welcoming, criticism. It is also important that we have a culture in which people are able to listen to whatever arguments and ideas they believe, in all seriousness, will help them see things in a new way. So a community that facilitates wisdom-loving wonder must also be a community of free speakers, or to put it a better way, I think, free conversationalists. There has been a lot of talk on this campus about free speech. Our university guarantees freedom of speech and of inquiry as a matter of right. There is no central authority that determines what teachers must, may, or may not teach. There is no central authority that vets invitations to outside speakers. And there is no central authority that determines which ideas students may or may not express. The only place the university as such will take action is with respect to people who obstruct teachers from teaching what they think should be taught, or who prevent university members from hearing and discussing ideas they have invited speakers to share. Now, I myself am in favor of the university's position on our rights to free speech and free inquiry, but we need to be very clear about something. Simply having these institutional freedoms does not guarantee a good outcome. We should not make the mistake of thinking that a community in which everyone can say whatever they want is inevitably a community in which wonder and truth and the productive search for wisdom will flourish. Freedom of speech is an intellectual liberty, but the point of that liberty is to allow for the development and exercise of a virtue, a human excellence of speaking freely. We as a university have been thinking a lot about freedom of speech as a liberty guaranteed by governments and universities, but it seems to me we need to do a lot more thinking about the relevant virtue. We need to think more about what free speaking is like when it's excellent. What I've been trying to suggest is this: the virtue or excellence of free speech is the ability to speak your mind in a serious conversation. And a serious conversation is the sort of conversation that leads to or springs from the experience of wondering. This ability does not develop simply on its own. Simply being protected in the right to speak our minds does not ensure that we will have the ability to do so well. We need to be thinking about what other institutional structures foster this excellence, and we need to be thinking about how we as individuals can get better at speaking freely in a way that leads to and from wonder. Now, if I were a social scientist, I might say something about institutional structures, but I'm trained in the humanities. So I want to close by saying something about the images and metaphors we use to talk about free speech and its value. Because lately I've been thinking that some of the standard metaphors for a community of free speakers present a distorted image of the way an excellent free speaker engages in conversation. And that matters because images of our ideals shape our deliberations and behaviors in subtle ways. So sometimes people defend freedom of speech. When they defend freedom of speech, they talk about the battlefield of ideas. This image suggests that people who speak freely are intellectual combatants, challenging and attacking opposed ideas. But this metaphor is obviously inadequate as a way of imagining free speech as a truth-seeking activity. No one goes to war in order to find out who should win or where the truth about anything lies. Can you imagine a soldier who pauses on the battlefield to wonder whose side she should be fighting on? An intellectual combatant is someone who has already decided what to think. She aims only to change the minds of others. She's not open to the discovery that she doesn't know what she's talking about, nor will she embrace the wonderful realization that the structure of reality is something somewhat different from what either she or her opponent had assumed. The metaphor of intellectual combat has no place in an academic ideal of free inquiry because its hero is incapable of wondering. Another common metaphor is the free marketplace of ideas. Just as competition in the free market improves our access to good products, so too, the story goes, free debate improves our access to true ideas. Now, let's leave aside the distortion involved in viewing someone who argues for an idea as trying to sell it. There are distortions here, but since you're students, you are more likely to see yourself in the role of consumer. But there are problems here too. A consumer typically tries to evaluate the quality of a product before buying it. She holds the product at arm's length, trying to make an evaluation before making a commitment. But ideas are not like that. There is no way to really understand a complicated theory without coming to see for yourself what can be said in its favor. Taking another person's ideas seriously is not simply a matter of repeating what they say. You must understand why their way of thinking seems reasonable. Now, it's possible to question and criticize ideas you learn about while standing at them from a distance. But unless you try to sympathetically enter into the other person's way of seeing, opening yourself to understanding why a reasonable person might think these ideas are true, you will not yourself be able to feel the force of whatever refutation you offer. Even if you decide the idea is a good one, if you try to evaluate before entering sympathetically into the thought, you will not wonder. Your mind may contain a collection of true ideas, but you will not have ever felt that friction of having your mind shaped by the world in the activity of thinking about it. Free, wisdom-seeking inquiry demands sympathetic engagement. It requires taking a bite of the apple before you've paid for it. Now, once you realize that, you see that we face a dilemma. Certain ideas strike us as intuitively odious. We don't want to engage sympathetically with them because we don't want to risk being changed by them. On the other hand, it can be hard to know in advance whether our aversion is complacent and defensive, born of unwillingness to really think about our own commitments. This is a real problem, and it cannot be solved simply by saying that in a free marketplace of ideas, everything should be allowed. That metaphor tempts you to think that you can be safe from thinking because you can evaluate intellectual products before you consume them. But engaging in conversation as a consumer will close you off from the possibility of wondering. Just as we should abandon the metaphor of intellectual combat, so too I think we should set aside the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas. And that's actually not so easy to do, either one of those. They're so steeped in our language. Free inquiry, the sort that inspires wonder and is oriented by wonder, is a joint activity. One person may put forward her ideas and another may criticize, but it's an attempt to think creatively together. This ideal of excellent free speaking requires courage, sympathy, goodwill, and trust. It's a form of intellectual friendship. You will develop intellectual friendships here over the next 4 years. And my hope is that you will take these friendships and the habits of serious, wondering discussion with you when you graduate to improve our civic discourse. So welcome to the University of Chicago. Thank you.
I want to thank Gabriel Richardson Lear for this very stimulating and challenging set of remarks, and I'm sure it will serve as an occasion for some very spirited debates back in the residence halls. On Monday, we all begin, the faculty, the students, the staff, we all begin the good and auspicious and virtuous work that brings us here every year, work that Gabriel has described so eloquently. I wish all of us, all of you, and all of us a very safe and productive and stimulating year in undertaking that work. Godspeed to all of you.